Hi, y'all. Welcome back to Bible 201. We are jumping into week 6, the wisdom literature. We have started each week looking at the relationship of God to God's people in the nation of Israel. And the foundation of that has been the commandments that God gave and the job that God gave, the responsibility to the Israelites to bind those commandments literally upon every aspect of their lives. Let it be the foundation. So, as we've walked through the Bible, now that we're getting close to the end, I just want to do a quick recap to make sure we're all on the same page together. So, quick overview. We had the Pentateuch with our 5 patriarchs: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and Moses. And that storyline of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, we received the news of God's covenant, of the giving of the law of the Exodus. Next step, we have Joshua as the transition figure from the last patriarch Moses as the Israelites come into the promised land and begin to establish themselves in that promised land. Then we get to the era of the judges. This is the leadership that God calls forth within those 12 independent tribes that make up the Israelite nation. Our transition figure from judges into the era of the monarchy is Samuel, the young child who's a miracle given to Hannah and then dedicated to the work of God in the temple. Now, Samuel is the one who anoints the first 2 kings of Israel, Saul and David. And at the end of David's life, we come to the succession of Solomon to the throne. So we walked through the first and second books of Samuel, and now we're coming to the books of Kings and Chronicles. So at the beginning of First Kings, we see chapter 1, verse 1, that it says King David was old and advanced in years. And so this is the opening line to essentially introduce the fact that the end of David's time as king is coming. And the question mark everybody's wondering is who's going to succeed him on the throne. Now recall, David is the one who unites the 12 tribes in that central act of worship and creates the city of David in Jerusalem. And the United Kingdom of Israel is a significant empire. So we can definitely guess and suppose, especially as we walk through that first chapter of First Kings, that there are multiple people vying for the succession. So there are multiple individuals vying for the throne, but the prophet Nathan goes to Bathsheba and says, "You need to go to David. It is your son Solomon who God is calling to be the new anointed one." Messiah is the Hebrew word for it, as we've talked about earlier in the series. So Bathsheba goes. Now, I love this moment because wisdom literature, which is the part of the scripture that we're coming into now, really sets a priority on walking through the depths of wisdom in relationship to the feminine aspects of culture at this point in time. So we see Solomon ascend to the throne, and we also see Solomon acting in many ways to go ahead and essentially build up the empire. The blessing and the fulfillment of the Abrahamic covenant is seen in chapter 4 when it states that the Israelites are greater than sands at the seashore. They are happy. Truly, this is a moment to mark because this is a fulfillment of one aspect of that Abrahamic covenant that God creates. So it tells us that in chapter 3, Solomon loved the Lord and walked in the statutes of his father David. And so in the beginning of Solomon's reign, there's a specific notation, essentially, that his heart is after the will of God, just like the scriptures noted about his father David. So this is the beginning of what we know as Solomon's sort of golden era. In a dream that evening, it says that God came to him and asked him, "What should I give you?" And Solomon in the dream asked for wisdom, asked for the ability to discern between what's good and what's evil so that he could lead his people. And scripture tells us that that request pleased God. And because he asked for that instead of long life or riches, that God would not only give him that discernment, that wisdom, but that God would also grant him blessings beyond his wildest dreams. And so, with that, we see this sort of standard raised for the era of this third and final piece of the United Kingdom of Israel under the monarchy of Solomon's leadership. So, First Kings lays out the beginning of Solomon's reign and succession into that role as king. What's interesting is that he is known for building campaigns, and specifically the building of the temple. But his building campaign really stretches into a lot of different areas. We see him in the area of safety. He destroys his enemies. Some call it street smart, some say it's revenge, but he does have killed the individuals who were attempting to succeed the throne instead of him. He creates alliances and builds up the empire that way. His first marriage we see with one of Pharaoh's daughters continues on, and we see a list of I'm guessing, some of the names, since it's reported that he had well over 70, if not 100 plus wives. But he marries into families with the Moabites, the Ammonites, Edomites, the Hittites, and on that list goes of alliances through marriage. But we do also see him building structures to grow his empire. He builds his own palace. He builds a special house just for the Pharaoh's daughter that he married. Most famously and significantly, he builds the temple. He does integrate a lot of work with infrastructure, names that he builds up Megiddo and Gizar, and creates international trade routes, especially for diplomatic use and for trading. We even see that there's a list of individuals who come to meet with him, including the Queen of Sheba. Now, we might sort of stop and ask ourselves, how much of this is hyperbole? How much of this is truth? I don't know that it matters. There is clearly anthropologically enough findings that yes, in fact, there was a nation called Israel. There were significant building structures created in this time period. The degree to which the wealth was real, the wives were as numerous, we don't know. We don't know for sure, but I think that we can get the picture that there is an image of this last monarch over the United Kingdom that is painted that emphasizes strength along with wisdom. Part of the wisdom literature in the scripture is attributed to this time period of Solomon's reign, this golden era where there were houses for education and scribes. Probably the most famous individual book attributed to the work of this wisdom literature is the book of Proverbs, where we see proverbial sayings. Now, wisdom literature is not unique to the Israelite nation. This is something we see all throughout ancient Mesopotamia. We see a number of different pharaohs who were known for their proverbial sayings and the writings of wisdom literature. We see this also in Samaria and Babylon. But what is unique about this wisdom literature is that there is a perspective on the divine source and being of all creation that is open to dialogue. The general understanding is that during this time period, wisdom literature, in order to be considered wisdom literature, uniquely had to look back on the generations and the wisdom of the generations before, and that intentionally you did not lean on your own emotions or feelings or lived experience. But you'll note that in much of the wisdom literature throughout the Hebrew Bible, there's actually an enormous emphasis on lived experience, personal emotions, everything from the ups and downs of the Psalms to the challenges faced within the book of Ecclesiastes that are so readily expressed, to the verve of love and lust in the midst of the Song of Solomon, to the dialogue that Job has directly with the creator of the cosmos. It is really unique to see this in wisdom literature from this time period. And it's also a part of what makes the Hebrew scriptures, I think, so fascinating and so practical for us today. That you can go to not just the proverbial sayings in Proverbs, but you can go and sit with Job or walk through the ups and downs of the Psalms or experience the sense of frustration in Kohelet with the scriptures of Ecclesiastes, and it is just as practical and useful and applicable to our lived experience today as it was when it was written. The wisdom literature in the Hebrew Bible is something that's really timeless, and it's not just about moral virtues and ethics. But there are objective observations and extended analogies that are just incredibly useful still for us today. So I encourage you, pick up the Psalms, pick up Proverbs. Not only are they easy to find because they're at the center of the Bible, but they are, quite frankly, I think the most accessible scripture to begin with for those who are seeking a relationship with God but really don't know where to start. Now we return back to the end of First Kings and walk through Second Kings, and we begin to see the downfall of the United Kingdom of Israel, and it comes to us in chapter 11. It seems such a swift move, but Solomon reigns for about 40 years, and we see that it's not his marriage necessarily with women from other foreign tribes, although he'll get some feedback about that from other parts of prophets and writers and redactors later in the Hebrew Bible. But specifically, it says that his heart was open to worshiping foreign gods. So in chapter 3, where we see that he loved God, that his heart was after the will of Yahweh, we see that the downfall begins the moment he starts to worship other gods, which we know after walking through the Pentateuch that that's the number one commandment, to put God first. We see that time and time again, that is the first and key request, that there be no other gods before the one true Yahweh. So, friends, as we end week 6 with the wisdom literature and we begin to look at the downfall of these scriptures, I encourage you, especially as you look through this, to note a few things. That the feminine pronoun is what's used for divine wisdom. We see that in Proverbs 8 and Proverbs 1 and multiple other places, while much of the New Testament writers later seem to recall only the negative aspects of the female influence, such as the seductress or the temptress. We actually see just as many, if not more, feminine aspects of wisdom related to divine wisdom. We see it in the telling of the story of Ruth and the telling of the story of Esther. We see it throughout Proverbs and Kohelet. And so I encourage you, as you tap into the Hebrew Bible, that you start to ask yourself questions about how different aspects of our relationships today and our culture today might benefit from going back and reading the heritage of our faith and the foundation of that faith. All right, friends, I look forward to your questions and your messages every week. So thank you for walking through week 6 with me. You can find me on Facebook as Rev Ren or at my blog site at revren.org. Blessings, y'all.